paleopathology. And like Emily said, there is nothing new under the sun. And many ancient animals, including dinosaurs, suffered from the same afflictions and diseases and trauma that we see in animals and even humans today. So what is pathology in general? What do I mean by that? Well, pathology just refers to the study of the cause of disease. This is all diseases. However, paleontologists are a little limited in what we can study because usually only the bones of animals are preserved. Not all the time, but usually. So paleopathology usually means we're looking at bone breaks and arthritis, cancer, and other diseases and trauma that affect the bone. And we see many examples of pathology in the fossil record, especially with reptiles. It seems extremely or very common. So we see them in dinosaurs and mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, crocodilians, turtles. All of these guys seem to have a higher instance of injury and disease than mammals do. And as to why exactly that is, I don't know. That's something that we're still trying to figure out. But what's important about studying pathology is that it gives us insight into the day-to-day lives and hazards that these animals would have faced. It tells us, were they fighting other animals? Were they fighting within species? Were they very clumsy? Were they breaking their bones a lot? Were they susceptible to certain kinds of diseases over others? Stuff like this. So on the right side here, we have a rib of a dinosaur, a herbivorous dinosaur called Buffingosaurus. And we see that this here, if you can see my mouse, is not normal. Usually it would look like the rest of the rib, but we can tell from tooth marks that this animal was attacked. But the attack didn't kill the animal. What happened after, this animal might have gotten away from its attacker, but maybe the attacker had a nasty bite, or maybe some dirt got rubbed in the wound after the animal got away. But somehow or another, this animal's bone got infected, and you can see swelling, and this infection actually started eating away at the bone, and that's what this cavity is here. And this infection very likely resulted in the death of this animal. But there are many examples of pathologies that we see in the fossil record. A very common one is broken bones. Some of them have healed over, which means the animal obviously survived. Others are not healed, which can indicate that the animal, this broken bone either happened immediately before the animal died or even resulted in the death of the animal. Like if we have a broken leg, an animal can't get around on a broken leg, so it'll probably starve to death or just die. There are lots of examples of fighting and biting. So some examples of interspecific combat that's fighting between individuals of two of the same species. This can be competition for resources or mates or just trying to put other animals in their place. There's lots of examples of infection, bone reabsorption, arthritis and gout, which is an extreme form of arthritis, and many, many more. But we're going to look at a few different dinosaurs today to see some of the infections and afflictions that plague animals. So first up, we're going to talk about Triceratops, one of the most famous dinosaurs. I'm sure all of you have heard about it. But there's been a lot of debate in the paleontological community over the years about what exactly these very impressive horns over the brow were for. Were they, some people have theorized they were for display, just to show off. Maybe they were for defending itself from big, scary dinosaurs like T-Rex. Or maybe they were used for fighting each other. And there is a 2009 study, which I cite in the corner here if you want to look at it for more information, that found these long bone scars, these lesions, on some of the frill and underneath the eye and other places all around the skull that are most likely from the horns of other Triceratops. So this study concludes that we're using their horns to fight. And so they probably weren't intentionally trying to gore each other to death. but it would more likely be like we see deer do today, where they interlock their horns, and occasionally they would just slip and leave these massive scars in the bone. I mean, this thing alone is about a foot long, and some are probably even bigger than that. So next up, we have Edmontosaurus. Edmontosaurus was a duck-billed dinosaur, a hadrosaur, very big animals, up to or over 40 feet long. So these things were about as big as T-Rex. And it lived in the late Cretaceous period alongside Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops and Pachycephalosaurus, which we actually talk about all three or all four of these animals today. I just realized. But fossils of these guys are found in Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota, all throughout the American West. And in some places, they are extremely common. I've done dinosaur digs with Southwestern Adventist University in eastern Wyoming, is where their dinosaur dig is. And Edmontosaurus is by far the most common dinosaur in these bone beds. There are probably thousands and thousands of animals buried here. And so this gives us lots and lots of data. We have lots of bones, which means we can see it gives us a lot of insight into how these animals lived and died. And one reason, something I want to highlight here is that Bethania Siviero here at Loma Linda University last year graduated and did her dissertation on Edmontosaurus and the pathologies we see in these animals. And so in the paper, which was just published in 2020, the authors looked at thousands of bones. I think it was over 3,000 bones they looked at. And they found a number of pathologies, injuries. And they found most of these pathologies occur in the tailbones, especially in the centrum and the spine of the tail vertebra. And they also found that the fingers and toes and ribs also show a number of healed fractures. But the tail bones show the most by far. And so these fractures, we see a healed fracture here. And so when you think about it, these tails were really big in relation to the animal. And so the animal could have been running and the tail could be slamming into a rock or a tree or another animal. Maybe these animals the tails are being stepped on when they were lying down, because these things traveled in herds of hundreds or thousands of animals. So that's why we see tails as a very common injury point in these animals. As you can see here, this is another bone of the tail called the chevron. So if we go back a couple slides, the chevron is this weird-looking bone that comes off the underside of the tail. Normally, they're in a very forked V shape, like a perfect V. However, in cases like this, we see how it has this little kink to it. This indicates that this bone actually broke and healed in place. And this is very similar to injuries that we see in animals today. I mean, dinosaurs were no different. They were clumsy, they stepped on each other, and their bones recovered. Moving on to a very popular favorite of a lot of people, tyrannosaurs. Tyrannosaurs, like many large carnivores or large reptiles, exhibit evidence of face biting. Now, face biting is especially prevalent in the modern crocodilians, especially juveniles. And it's basically a way to establish dominance. So if two animals are eating and, a little runt of the litter, a little brother gets too close, then another animal will just like jump on the face, and will know to back off or go somewhere else for a little bit. And while these injuries or this face biting isn't intended to kill the other animal, it's these animals have very sharp teeth, very big teeth, and very powerful bites. And so this face biting will actually leave evidence, will actually scar the bone. And in some cases, like this juvenile Tyrannosaurus we have here, this juvenile probably got too close to a big brother who was eating its meal and got munched really bad, really hard. And the teeth of the other Tyrannosaurus actually punctured the skull of this guy. But we can see from healing around the bones that this animal lived throughout that. However, we can see that it really got chomped hard, enough to actually deform the skull a little bit. So this line the skull should be perfectly symmetrical on either side of this line, but it got bit so hard that it would have actually deformed the nose a little bit, which is, I mean, that would hurt. But nevertheless, it wouldn't have affected how the animal lived and ate. Next up, we have Stu the T-Rex, the most famous Tyrannosaurus specimen and the most complete Tyrannosaurus specimen we have. So usually pathologies in general in dinosaurs are pretty rare. But in some very complete individuals, they are, especially old ones, like Stu the T-Rex. Stu was a pretty old Tyrannosaurus. And so old dinosaurs are rife, just absolutely rife with pathologies. Arthritis, like we see in this tail vertebra here in the lower left corner. Lots of breaks in the ribs, and you see these swelling around the ribs. That's indicating that the bone is healed, and so it's a callus around the original bone break. We're looking at the skull in the upper right corner, or upper left corner, sorry. We have these enigmatic holes in the lower jawbone, and those have long been theorized to be puncture marks from another T-Rex. So the face biting we just talked about, it's thought that, oh, maybe it's caused from that. But more recent research suggests that that is an infection of a certain bacteria that we still see in animals and reptiles today. And maybe that is initially caused by a face bite from a Tyrannosaurus that had a lot of icky bacteria in its mouth. So when it bit, it would have transmitted the bacteria directly to the flesh and to the bone. Okay, last but not least, we have Pachycephalosaurus. This is an animal you probably have heard of. So Pachycephalosaurus had a very thick dome of bone right on top of its head, up to 9 inches thick. I mean, that's a lot of solid bone on top of its skull. Obvious conclusion is that it was using these bones to headbutt each other, like modern day bighorn sheep. But not all paleontologists agreed with that, even though it did seem obvious. They're like, well, what evidence do we have? So paleontologists looked into this, and they found that they found a lot of lesions, the swelling and abnormalities in the bone, right on top of the skull. So we can see here a little more clearly in this simplified sketch of it, of the dome. But we find most of the bony lesions and pathologies happen right on top of the skull, on the thickest part of the dome, is where all of these lesions are concentrated. And this is direct evidence that these animals engage in headbutting behavior, which really shouldn't come as that much of a surprise, because what else are you going to do with a 9-inch thick dome of bone on top of your head? But all that to say that there's nothing new under the sun. These animals suffer from the same afflictions that other animals do, because they were just animals. This is how they lived and died. And second is that these animals humans weren't around to help these animals out. Unlike today, where we have different vaccinations and treatments where we can help out wild animals. So with that, I will turn it over to Charity and her guest.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're going to talk less about injury and more on the side of infection by a pathogen, specifically more towards the side of viruses is what I have. But would they know it's suspected to be a bacterial infection that we see in the jawbone, right?
Yeah.
Is there a way to differentiate? Would we be able to know the difference if it was some kind of protist infection versus virus versus a bacteria?
Yeah, so the reason we concluded it was a bacterial infection is because it's very similar to an infection that we see today in modern day reptiles. So we can actually look at modern day examples of pathogenic infection, whether it's bacteria or virus or whatever, and compare it to pathologies that we see in fossil bones, and say, okay, well, we think it's a similar virus or bacteria that was affecting this animal, just like it is in modern animals.
Okay. And is there any example of fossilized bacteria? Like, does the pathogen itself get preserved, or is there any evidence of it?
So we do have fossil single-celled animals, but they're pretty rare and only in certain locations, like in chert deposits, which have a very, 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 very fine grain size. Um, and this is, we have bacteria from like before the dinosaurs. I don't know of any bacteria that are actually from the time of the dinosaurs. Most dinosaurs are preserved in sandstone or limestone, which just doesn't have the resolution to preserve very, very, very small organisms and bacteria.
All right, that's awesome. Cool, thank you. So most of what I wanted to talk about was wildlife, modern wildlife, and the sort of infections that they face that are sort of because of or related to their interactions with humans. So David Quammen wrote a book called Spillover, which is all about zoonotic diseases. And zoonotic means that it is a disease we see in people that began from a disease known to animals. So there's a lot of animal diseases. There's a lot of them that don't affect people. And when something jumps to a person from an animal, we call it zoonosis, Z-O-O-nosis, or a zoonotic disease. And so, of course, the most recent and topical example of that is the coronavirus that we're seeing now, SARS-CoV-2, which is believed to have been originally a bat virus, kind of jumped to a possibly pangolin vector, and then came to people through markets in Asia. And so it's one of those things where we can't say for certain, but we can compare viruses that we know of that are found in these animals and see how closely related they are to the ones that we're seeing in people. And so bats actually have fantastic immune systems, and they have very high metabolic rate, very high body temperature, and they are also subject to a lot of pathogens. So bats tend to be one of the things that is often considered a vector for human disease, because viruses change so much in bats, and bats are so adaptable in combating these illnesses that there's a lot of mutation rate. There's a lot of differences in viruses from one point in time to another in the bat populations. And so we're also seeing increasing connection between bats and people. I mean, as we move around and as we expand and develop more of wildlife, of nature, we come into contact with those sorts of things and we get exposed to them. So it's kind of part and parcel to development. But that said, a lot of what I want to talk about is the way that we combat viruses in animal populations. And because we also, not only do animals bring disease to us, and David Quammen suggested that as much as 60% of human diseases are actually zoonotic in origin. So they came originally from an animal and then came to us. So that's a pretty good number. And not only that, we kind of allow the spread of disease in animals. And that happens because of domestication and the way that we bring animals from one place to another. And along with those animals, we bring viruses and pathogens. And so one that's really common in wild animals that spreads mainly through humans is distemper, and it's a morbillivirus. So it's we see it a lot in canine. So canine distemper is a really common illness among dogs, and we vaccinate our dogs for them. So if you have a pet dog, their regular shots that they get, that takes care of canine distemper. The problem is that there's a lot of stray dogs who haven't had those vaccinations. There's a lot of places where people don't have access to those shots for their pets. And so in wild places where there's a border between where the people live and where the animals live, and they come up close to each other, a lot of times those diseases from our pets can infect the wild animals. And so distemper is a different one, or an interesting one, because it's very, very prevalent, and it affects all kinds of species. So there's distempers that affect cats, and we've seen them in lions in Africa. We've seen them in tigers in India, and places where people live have their pet dogs. Dogs are subject to distemper, and it jumps to the wildlife. So that one, it spreads more easily, of course, to like hyenas and African wild dogs, because they're also dogs. They're not too distantly related to our pets. And we see those in wolves. We see canine distemper in wolves in Europe a lot as well. And so an interesting one that I wasn't aware of was that distemper, there is a dolphin distemper virus. So even dolphins and porpoises are affected by the same virus, or a very similar related virus that we see in our pet dogs. So that's the one that we're going to talk about mostly today is called phocine distemper, and that one is actually affecting seals and sea lions. And because I mean, they're the dogs of the sea, right? So they have their own version of this virus, and they can actually get it, and it can spread from your domestic pets, from your dog. So if taking your dog on a walk to the beach might seem harmless, but if your dog is a carrier for distemper, it can actually infect the other animals that live there, and it can be harmful to them. So with endangered populations, we as humans, I think, have a responsibility that if we introduce these viruses, we also help to prevent the spread and help to treat the animals that get affected by them. And so that's one thing that we do. We actually do that in pretty much all the forms of wildlife. The problem is the ability to do it, the ability to contact a lion or a tiger to scoop it up and give it a shot is not as simple as it might sound. And so a lot of times you see those tranquilizer darts that they'll use. So I mean, if you're going to tranquilize the animal so that you can walk up and give it a shot, you could just skip a step and you can put the vaccination in a dart and use that. And that's been used. It's just, it's one of those ethical considerations where you wonder if you're doing more harm than good. And so there's a lot of back and forth on that, but we do try to help wild animals as much as possible, especially if we are the ones who are introducing the disease. And so with that, we're going to go back to phocine distemper, our seal virus, and talk about they do elephant seals,